There was once a land of eternal sun, but there being no word for sun, no shadows were cast. And the fiery orb was uncertain of its true identity and purpose. Then the day came when shadows began to fall, and the sunny center became aware of itself and was pleased. Some, however, in the area where the shadows fell were less so, and thus do things stand today. Once upon a time there was a land in which, one day, all of the people suddenly became aware of what was going on. And at first they were truly amazed at what they saw. Then after a few days became even more amazed as they began to wonder why they'd never seen it all before. Life will let men get by with a lot, but not with that. And if you're right, after listening to you so many times, take something you'd already said and apparently well established, and then turn it upside down and inside out, makes me wonder, in this area you've just brought up, if there's not the possibility of, rather than life not letting men realize this or that particular thing, it's a matter of it not being able to let him do so. And that therein is the basis for the seemingly insurmountable odds with which a mystic is faced. Well, sir, that's quite a mouthful for a viewer. To the simple, life is like driving uphill on a frozen roadway. To the more sophisticated, it is also like trying to navigate such a treacherous terrain, but with the added problem of having to watch out for the simple who operate their vehicles in such a thoughtless manner. It is from this that routine city intellectuals periodically muse that perhaps they are happiest who think the least. And while it may seem a nice poetic grasp, it yet, for some unidentifiable reason, fails to fully satisfy them. To find fault with a young sprinter in training should not be the same as criticism of the lame, yet ordinary thought constantly fails to make such a distinction. The problem a mystic has with thinking is that if it doesn't make sense, the mind can't entertain it. But if it does, he can't use it. Some dead people were talking, and one of them said, "God, but sometimes I think I can't bear up under the strain." And another replied, "And I hear it gets even worse when you're alive." A kid looked up from his reading and asked his father, "What's the difference in these so-called more conscious men and everyone else of reasonable intelligence?" And the old man answered, "Seems to be that when the first group walks through a freshly fertilized flower garden, they recognize where both the pleasant and pungent odors come from." In a desire to participate in things New Age, one man announced that he was going to channel for himself. But no one was interested, and after a bit, neither was he. The simple worry about being physically imprisoned, while the more sophisticated are troubled over notions of intellectual restraints. Only those of expanded awareness are concerned where it matters, that is, over the fact that thought itself is the supreme captor. One day the king sat and pondered, "Should I go to war, on whom do I want to defend? My philosophers and astrologers, or my generals and infantrymen?" And while the answer immediately seemed obvious, he was further moved to wonder just what sort of warfare he actually had in mind. Now for tonight's tip from our field guide to emotional birds. How to spot the religious. They're the ones always pissed about something. Basic human thinking is still, by necessity, structured so that it initially overlooks the obvious. Were things not so arranged, man would not have even progressed intellectually to the place where he is now. It is understandable why so many outside the activity see the hunger for a transcendental state of consciousness as a desire to return to some previous condition. And not infrequently is this view shared by those apparently inside. And once more, you're open to the interesting issue of how can progress be both progress and non-progress? And why do binocular visioned creatures only see depth correctly when they use two eyes? No more, no less. And while the no less seems childishly obvious, the no more appears patently foolish, except to those more conscious with broader sight. Lacking real understanding, the simple will take local examples and personal anecdotes as proof of whatever needs to be proved. Hearing ordinary minds explain life and predict the future is like seeing a water molecule stick its tongue out at the ocean. Archaeology update. The Tower of Babel was not actually destroyed. It's only been hiding, and none too well at that. Legacy update. The simple will not inherit the earth. They never lost possession of it. If you can correctly translate simple into basic. And of your rights, sometimes when you speak of the simple, it sounds to me to be in a negative way, while in other references it does not seem so. Where is the consistency in this, and why do you do it? I keep telling you, it's tuxedos in the ballroom, overalls in the garage. There was once a man who gave lectures on the mystical, and sometimes he would talk for months directly about the mystical, then go for long periods talking about everyday affairs from a mystical viewpoint. And finally one of his listeners asked him why he used this dual approach rather than addressing all of the time the subject itself solely. And the lecturer gave him this reply: "That is a fair question." One chap was struck with the following: why are all of man's pictures of supernatural beings, both good and bad, always in part mortal? Demons simply being men with horns and hooves, and angels but men with wings. Why, even in such an area where you'd expect his imagination to be truly free, are his mental concepts so mortally bound? Obviously, can no livers dream of gods non-bile in nature? So how come penthouses to theorize their architecture and take not into account the building's very foundations? There is a mentally unrecognized basis upon which a ship can make greater headway if it is unaware of the water, a sort of overriding of drag by way of inattention. Another of those physically impossible principles, yet one magnificently operational exclusively in the case of man. According to yet another version of one creation myth, man got driven from the original Garden of Paradise like this. Life told him not to talk, then made him start talking, then pretended to accidentally catch him at it and get so mad about it as to run him off. And by the old by, if this rendition doesn't make perfectly good sense to you, then you're still as conned as was Adam. After a lifetime of studying the situation, one man finally came to this: once you've pointed out that the mind makes up everything it thinks, what else is there to say about it? He not only, as soon as he thought this, found it highly interesting, but shortly afterwards, even more so when he became aware that, in spite of him now having thought and realized this, he forgot all about it more often than not. So here's a game for you. What's more fascinating than the many things man does not know? His forgetting of the things he does. Now here's a song title for you: Only the Mind Forgets, Never the Stomach. In a desire to be part of the New Age, one man read many books, attended numerous lectures, then said to himself, "My body does have an unsuspected intelligence of its own. It must. All these other people say that it does. And why would I listen to them if not to get information that I could not come up with on my own? We gather here not to bury the experts, but rather to define them more clearly. A large part of being civilized is in pretending that you are more civilized than you actually are. And once again, we are greeted by that intriguing, unique mental reality of something not so, functioning as though it were. Only those less than fully mortally realized ever stoop and slip to criticizing man. Now for tonight's tip from our field guide to visually impaired birds. How to spot those who know something from those who don't. Those who do never say that they do. God, I hate dreams, said one man. You mean when you're asleep? Asked a friend. Yeah, then too. A viewer writes, on your last show you read a story about a mystic who had been talking to a group of people for a number of years and who one day informed them that there had been a flaw at the heart of everything he had told them and that they should ignore everything he had said up to then and that they'd start over afresh. And what I want is assurance for my hearing of the tale, that is, that the mystic meant that he had knowingly and willfully injected what he is now calling a flaw at the core of his earlier comments for some specific purpose which had now been served. Am I correct? Yours, etc. Everything thought is a coded message, and only a few discover the key. A man once asked a mystic, is there anything that could be said to ordinary men that has real transcendental potential? And the normally reticent one pondered this for a bit, then replied, you could offer them this rhetorical observation, if the obvious can't possibly be true, then what can? Another man once asked a mystic, I continue to hear people speak of man's spirit, and I'm uncertain as to what they think they mean. Are they actually, if unknowingly, referring to man's instinctive life? And the normally deadpan one just smiled. Then yet another man asked a mystic, do people really ask you stuff, or do you guys just make up stories about it? Another tale regarding the graduations of men. The simple want someone to tell them that there is a plan and purpose to life, while the more sophisticated will go so far as to make harmless, passing speculations themselves as to what it might be. But as always, it is the more conscious, God bless them, who get the final line in these kinds of stories. Another entry from our Transcendentalist Dictionary of Terms. Sleep in bed at night. A mystic's only time out. And a forced one at that. Among ordinary people, bad news is more popular than good for the same reason that they find it almost impossible to say anything positive about man. Show me a man who can appreciate a myth of an encouraging nature, and I'll show you a man who misunderstood the myth. In a relaxed moment after the last meal one night, the head monk so said to a younger one, there are actually only two reasons to ever talk about the lives ordinary men lead. One is as a reflective device to highlight some specific point, and the other is just to kill time till your listeners are ready to hear what you really want to talk about. Now some sports news. If man is a game, then two playing fields are laid out within him. And now some more sports news. If man is a game, then two playing fields are laid out within him, not counting the additional three extant in mystics. The simple see death as death. The more sophisticated try and view it as a metaphor for something else. And then the more conscious know it to be both what it is and something else. Man's unrecorded theme song. You can listen to your belly or you can listen to your head, But one way or the other, your belly's going to win. That is, if you're at all sane. One guy squeaked when he walked, and one guy squeaked when he talked. And between them both kept every cat in the house occupied. Math for mystics. No matter how high you count, it's not high enough. The speaker declared, only the gods, not men, are capable of criticizing man. And from the audience someone said, but for that to have an equitable basis, not only must men be able to imagine the gods, but also the gods able to imagine man, and of that we have no evidence. Unrequested corollary to an earlier item covered tonight. To ordinary thinking, an expert is always someone else. Only to a mystic is it himself. He has no choice. It must be. First guy says, adequate aggression can compensate for a multitude of deficiencies. And second guy says, like intelligence? To which the first guy replies, that above all. One day a man said to a mystic, I have heard it said that a wise man should not converse with kings. And the mystic replied, that is so. And the man continued, I've also heard it said that a wise man should not converse with fools. And the mystic replied, that too is so. And the man asked, does that cover it? And the mystic replied, not quite. And here's the rest of it. A wise man shouldn't be talking to anybody. Oh, said the man sheepishly and somewhat knowingly. Another view of the problem with trying to talk about the cure of the secret. Those who don't think they're sick don't want to hear about it, and those who think they are too sick to benefit from it. Gadzookas, gushed a beaming Hippocrates. Had I known the joy awaiting me therein, I would have gone directly into medicine and not wasted those years in the Peace Corps. A man once asked a mystic, if it is important to see the obvious, yet seems so difficult to do so, what's the trick? And the rambunctious one replied, one is to take things as you see them now and reverse them. Ooh, shivered the man erotically and somewhat knowingly. The evolution of things as per one man. First, you get to where you can't hardly stand to hear other people talk. Then you get to where you can't hardly stand to read anything they've written. Then you get to where you can't hardly stand even being around them. And then you get to where you can't hardly stand just being alive. Then if you can make it past that, you may have a chance. End of quote. Another example of how life actually works. Although the mind is not wired up to see things this directly, the most important thing in becoming a successful author is to have a really good typewriter or word processor. Now, I was not quoting somebody's opinion. That one was just a direct news item. In apparent solicitation of guidance, a man said to a mystic, I feel so lost and uncertain, to which the broad one replied, is it any wonder? You're alive. Then there was this man who was mystical only on alternate days, who finally inquired of himself, is it weirder being more conscious or being ordinary? A man asked a mystic, how much would it take to get you to tell me what you really privately think about life? And the mystic just laughed. A man asked a mystic, how much would it take to get you to tell me what you really privately think of life? And the mystic replied, it's a shame I can't take your money, but I couldn't do it for any amount, for there's not enough money available to compensate me for the damage I'd do myself if I did. At the end of the last time we were doing this, I started on something that was not part of the evening's plan, script. But it seemed to have struck a note with some people, so I'm going to pick it up. Because it was connected to what we were talking about last time. Assuming anybody remember what we were talking about last time, and that was important. But here, I know I'm repeating myself, but by God, here is just a primo example of man's innate mental inability to see and identify the obvious amidst all other reasonable, ordinary, routine possibilities. Consider how well, and we're talking about ordinary, everyday people, how well men speak of the dead. In fact, especially so, if this makes any difference to help you get going, how well, how highly, with what high regard men speak of the freshly dead. Take somebody, just anybody you know, or a man by reputation, a guy you know was just nobody, a drunk, a ne'er-do-well, and you attend his funeral, and there his body's laid out. Time is not the litmus test of this, but there he's laid out. And you know who he is, and people get up in their eulogies and speak of him with high regard. Now, there are several possibilities from an ordinary view. Take the facts as I have laid them out. There are at least two distinct explanations for this. One is a rather cynical, as it would be called, view, and that is that it's just all bullshit. That the people, it's just a show. It's a sham with no particular thought as to the possible purposes there behind. Another one would be a more psychologically based view, probably called, that you would say that it's based upon some form of guilt, that the people involved, his family, his friends, are now speaking in gushing terms about the man to make up for the fact that in life they had so little good to say about him. The whole idea of, oh, if I could just bring back poor so-and-so for another few minutes and finally tell him or her how much I love them and appreciate them, but now it's too late. So it's like a form of guilt or a form of compensation, psychologically speaking. And I guess to wrap it all up, you could say a third possibility is to take up for any other contingency that might pop into your little brain, would be that it's simple customs, courtesy, and custom. That's the way we do things in this part of the world, in this particular culture, that no matter who the person is, if he had any acquaintances, any family, then it's their responsibility, of course, to bury the man, to see to his remains are put to rest somewhere. And it's simply our custom, has been that way, ere as long as memory serves us, that we get up and say some kind words. You simply, if you were pointing out how I started this example laid out, an ordinary observer would say, well, what do you expect us to say? I mean, sure, he was a drunk. We all know that, and he was a bum. He owed us all money. But what the hell? The man's dead. What are we going to do? We don't get up and say, well, I'm glad that rascal's dead. So, all of that, now remember the basis of it, and this is true all over the world. It's nothing new, and as you might guess, I'm about to belie all the possible explanations. But those three easily cover every normal possibility that you would think of. Again, we just have a man, if you want to, consider that he was disreputable in life, and everyone knew it, everyone that's in attendance now, and yet those same people get up there and now speak very highly, with great regard for the man. Everyone in the audience goes along with it, at least passively. No one stands up and counters it and says, well, why are you saying that? There it is, a man that no one had any particular regard for. He's been dead less than 24 hours. And there they are, speaking of him as though he was a recently departed saint, when everyone involved knows that he wasn't. And then I could lay out this subject, this scene, to ordinary minds and say what possibly could be going on, and somewhere in those three examples I gave, the three possibilities would cover any possibility that any intelligent, ordinary, sane, educated, sophisticated, simple would come up with. Either, the facts as I gave them, either it is just a show, that the people are just as insincere as they can be. They simply are. Either that, or they're now feeling guilty, and they're just trying to make up for it, or it's just simply that everyone's playing out their assigned, expected roles based upon local custom and habit. Just good manners. What is the one thing, to remind you all this has nothing to do with funeral services and customs, has nothing to do with sincerity, has nothing to do with cynicism. I am giving you just, sure I'll come up with no one. I know I keep saying, here's one of the best examples, but I don't know if it's going to get any better than this. Examples of man's innate mental inability to look at all of the possibilities, complex, simple, convoluted, educated, exotic, but of all possible. And I just gave you those three big ones about why would this take place, what could possibly be the motivation behind it. Amidst all of those, man has an innate mental inability to simply look at the obvious. I am tempted from hearing a few people in advance of my comment go, I'm good mind just to not tell you. Or ask for a vote. It's not, well, you know, this is not a battle of wits between me and anybody else in the world. But it is so far removed from the possibility. Knowing some of you people here personally, I bet those of you that might have gone, that if I stopped and said, well, what is it you were imagining I'm about to point out? I'll bet you there would be some quite intriguing, maybe even provoking responses. But I would also wager that no one, it's just the way the mind is set up, would consider the obvious. Plus, before I tell you, I got to point this out. As soon as I tell you, all you've got to do is refer back to your own ordinary thinking, or be aware of what ordinary sane people would think, that before I even tell you what it is, any ordinary sane mind, as soon as I point it out, is going to say, well, yeah, I'd never thought about it because it can't be. Oh, yes, it can. So what could be? That I'm saying the obvious that has made this be true, that the oldest written records ordinary people are aware of, that we have 3,000 or 4,000 years now of hieroglyphics, if not writing, and some of the earliest ones always has to do with death. And it shows by little pictures, little stick figures, or penny postcards, or whatever was left, of the kinds of funerals, the kind of services that the local populace engaged in regarding the departed. And you can just see it in the little pictures. It's a great deal of respect. They treat all of the dead. So it's always been true, it continues to be true right this second, that a man of no particular regard or a man of less than average regard will be treated in the manner I said within hours after he's dead. He's laying right there, and it was only 26 hours ago that he cheated somebody there in the crowd, that he got drunk and wrecked his car. Maybe that's how he got killed. That it's been no more than a day, and everybody knows what a dishonorable, unworthy, just from ordinary views, man he was, and yet here they are. Not just ministers making 10 or 12 bucks, not just somebody from the funeral home, but those who knew him. And you would think of every possibility, which I tried to cover. I just made it 3. That it's a sham, or it's just custom, or it's guilt. If it had made it more impressive, I know I'm dragging it out. If I could have made, instead of 3, I could have cut them up into a dozen and said, here's all those possibilities. But you're supposed to be getting sharp enough now not to worry about just my 3 divisions. It's every possibility in the world. But the ordinary mind is not wired up. Contraire, it is not wired up to look at the obvious. So what is the obvious? That there they stand, and I've always done it, continue to do it, and stand, engaged in some form of ritualistic ending to a man's life. And that someone will say good words about the man and speak of him with high regard, regardless of what he was 24 hours before or 3 hours before. What can be going on? Here's the obvious possibility. That in death, ordinary people do become better men. You don't see me laughing. And the mind would say, well, that's ridiculous. And now forget all ideas of ordinary religion about, well, yeah, they're now with God. No, forget all that shit. I'm saying take away all possible. Take away your imagination. Take away the theories of some supernatural extra-systemic intervention after death. The possibility, a physical possibility. Because there are similar things happens in the world of plants, gardening, bulbs, the rejuvenation of life. It is not impossible. I know the mind immediately will say, no, it can't be. But here's the possibility. That when they die, ordinary people, when they die, just immediately, you become a better person. Huh? The examples do not come any better. Well, until my next one. And what I was also picking up right toward the tail end, whether it actually got on the tape last time. You get some notion of that, and right now, let me put that out as a distinct physical, material possibility, that I don't mean it metaphorically. That would answer all possible questions and a whole bunch more, but I'm just going to get into one or two other side aspects of that. But consider what I just said as non-metaphorical. And then we'll get into that which is open to further consideration on the allegorical side of the ledger. But consider that as a physical, material possibility, and from that, as always, arose the ritualistic behavior, which itself is an allegory. Allegories do not, well, they can arise from other allegories, but the origins of any ritualistic behavior, which is simply a physical allegory, some metaphor put into practice, the origins are never, well, you can trace it back through several levels, but the origins is never a metaphor. Metaphors do not arise originally from a metaphor. They arise from the obvious. They arise from what ordinary people like to call reality. After that, metaphors can branch out. They can breed. But if you go back, if you just take one allegory and say, well, to me that represents, that's just some sort of metaphorical behavior that actually is a metaphor for so-and-so, and you look at the so-and-so, it's as you see it, and ask yourself, well, is that still a metaphor? And unless you're becoming more conscious, that's as far back as you'll normally take it. But that's not the origin. So what I'm saying is, consider that is the possible, physical, that is the real, as ordinary people like to call it, the real origins of all of this behavior, of all of man's attitudes toward death, all the way from the extremely simplistically religious to even those of a more humanistic philosophical bent who may support, in theory, some idea of reincarnation. But even they are hard-pressed if you say, well, how is it that you will stand there, or if you stand there generically and lie or say that about somebody that everybody in the room does not believe, that just before he died, he was a ne'er-do-well. And now you're suddenly speaking about him like he was a damn near saint. And even taking away the religious aspects. If we're talking to those who do not claim any particular religious ties, so that they cannot fall back on the idea of, well, only God knows his soul, and so now that he is dead, it's not up to us to judge. Maybe God took him into his heart, great compassion. Of course, all religions got those kind of stories of the thief on the cross and a Jesus, that is, a more conscious man, saying, well, what the hell? I'm going to put in a good word for you. You'll be more conscious in just a minute because you'll be dead. They always have those stories the way out. But now back to keeping in mind that I am saying that could be a physical possibility. I can't resist pointing this out also. You see that the ordinary mind would reject that, religious or otherwise. If an actual religious person heard me say this and understood the intent that I meant it, that I said, no, it's got nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with any ideas of a supreme extra systemic force. I'm saying, what if physically a dead person is a better man at the ordinary level? And they understood that I did not mean that in any way metaphorical. I didn't mean it spiritual. I meant that physically, the son of a bitch, now he's dead, may be a better person right now. They go, well, you know, that's just insane. Consider this, though. Not only can it be true physically, I mean, there's no way that even an ordinary mind, they wouldn't go so far as to argue with me and try to debate it. But there is no way that you can, no matter, I say ordinary mind, you could have a extremely high IQ and all sorts of education, special expertise in many fields. But you do realize there's no way you can disprove what I said, even theoretically. There's no formula, there is no chemical, no electrical certainty that says that that could not be true. In fact, there are there's similes, there are metaphorical similes, as I said, in all the other aspects of sentient life on this earth, or of life on this earth, that would support that. There is no way that you can say that definitely cannot be. I know it's insane and the ordinary mind would just dismiss it. But assume, what I was going to say before I get into the other area, if that were true, there would be no further questions about death. Of course, nobody's going to see this because, as in many other areas I can point out, the human mind en masse is never going to see directly anything like that because it would wreak havoc. It would interrupt the parade as it's moving now. And life's not going to allow that. Or to give it a cheap shot, I could point out, boy, that'd be bad news because, to begin with, most ministers would be out of work, at least full-time. Look at all the people who work in the mortuary sciences, as they call it. Look at all those that would be out of work. Look at all the limo companies that get, on weeknights, weekdays, slow times of year, they expect funerals. There'd be all sorts of it would disrupt the economy. That was the cheap version. Now back to what I was saying, keeping in mind, if you can, that simultaneously with me moving into what could be, well, I'm giving you the way out that I may not mean this as physically as I point out the possibility that the reason that we speak so highly of the dead ordinarily is the possibility, the one possibility that stops all speculation, picks up all the loose ends, tightens up all the hems that are coming loose, stops up all the holes in your roof, takes all the leaks out of your plumbing, adequately, supremely so, weather strips your house inside and out, is to realize, well, wait a minute, it's all quite simple. There's one explanation that explains it all. There's nothing else to say, and that is, when people die, they become better people. Keeping that in mind, where I was picked up the tail end, was now, this may be metaphorical, of course, now. Well, it's definitely metaphorical about the figures I was going to mention, but I was going to pull out a kind of Jesus, these Jesuses. And without trying to go into any sort of attempted history, the stories of heroes, legendary figures, demigods being slain, being murdered by the common man, and then coming back to life. I hate to break the news to you, but that did not by any means originate with the Jews. Did not originate with Christianity. The story is old as hell, and they continue to repeat it. But it's on the basis that there is a heroic figure, and the ones that are most commonly known are always, after the fact, then purported to be at least semi-divine. I guess they dropped that. I used to hear people try to use the semi-divine, and then they figure, screw that. He was divine. Of course, the semi-divine is to get you out, of the question of somebody saying, wait a minute, if he's a God, then what the hell was he doing living down here in Augusta, Georgia, or Jerusalem, and how the hell did he end up letting them kill him? Well, all right, glad you asked that. He was only half a God. Okay. He was on vacation. He was working part-time. Anyway, you know how it goes. The Jesuses of the world, based upon what I just said, that the possibility that ordinary people, the reason that they are spoken so highly of, By the way, when I said, freshly dead, and I keep saying this 24-hour thing, I was just trying to bring it up to a feeling of immediacy. It's not just that. It's once you're dead. I mean, I now read little, for years and years it was used as a proper name synonym, the adverse use of referring to someone as being Hunnish or Attila-ish. In other words, the bad rap on Attila the Hun, and there are now some writings out. They've discovered some records that some travelers made and said, contraire, that the man was quite hip, sophisticated, well-bred, off on his spare time when he wasn't plundering and raping. In other words, he has been dead long enough that the man's beginning to be rehabilitated. If you're ordinary, you go, well, that's all that is. That's history rewrit. Da-da-da. You can say that. But that's the same way. That's no different. All you've done is change the time frame. It's no different than my guy who was a drunk, disliked, worthy of no respect, and 24 hours later they're speaking of him and bringing tears to their eyes over his great deeds and his honorable stature in the community. There's no difference, just the time frame. Anyway, death. I just wanted you to understand, I wasn't referring that it just happens now. That's just when it's more glaring. But after death, given enough time, if history needs to make someone sound better, almost everybody sounds better. Based upon that, I was going to point out that if it be a possibility, a physical possibility, to start from that, a literal possibility, until we get into the potential use of metaphorical descriptions, that if it be possible, physically and literally, that ordinary people, when they die, become better people, then if that be so, then it would explain why the Jesuses of the world keep popping back up when they kill them. Do you see why? It's because death, they're not limited to death as their form of self-improvement. Now, I will grant you this if I didn't make it clear enough. I am talking double talk now. That is, I am speaking metaphorically and literally. You got to be able to think that way. I should say, rather than me speak that way, you should be able to think that way. To forget the ideas of these Jesus and people coming back to actual physical life, just forget that, or just assume that's not true. But then, you're left with this, as always. What is being represented, that these stories are so widespread and is not limited to simple-minded, uneducated people, that men of high sophistication from the ordinary view will certainly swear that they believe that it's inexplicable, but hey, that's the way God and supernatural things work. But in every culture that amounts to anything, left any history, there will be stories of some sort of superhero, some sort of supernatural being, which is a more conscious person, showed up in their midst at one time, and through a series of unfortunate events, the people, rather than honoring the man and learning from him, killed the son of a bitch. But 2 days later, a fortnight, somebody looks around the woods and there he is. Or suddenly in the middle of town there's this hooded figure that no one recognizes, and somebody pulls it aside, and it's him. They cannot keep these mythical heroes dead, even in their stories. Why could that be? Forgetting now all the, again, appealing to the illusionary extra-systemic explanations. All the possibilities that never explain anything. What could be the easy one? I just told you that if what I originally presented could literally be true, that ordinary people, when they're dead, in death become better people, then the Jesuses of the world, they keep popping back. They can't keep them dead for a simple reason. That death was not their required form of self-improvement. Therefore, it had nothing to do with it. Work on that. Either completely unrelated, or for those of you who know better, otherwise, I'm going to take this time tonight to do two things that may be totally unrelated, right? Right. There was a news item the other night. It was talking about someone talking to a king, and sounded like, even in the news story, in the story I made up, it sounded like to be a certain amount of double talk and etc. And it said that the king later mused, after what had been said to him, that he mused to himself, considering the king now metaphorically to be the best spot at ordinary people's thinking. Their head, their leading neural connections, the meanest wolf inside their neocortex. That the king said to himself, he noted that the best cons, you know what a con is, a con game, that the best cons are always simple and crude. I know that there are many, many books I know written about famous swindles and con games of all time, and they will spend chapters and chapters on the Dutch East Indian tulip scandal. Seems to be the one everybody loves because they can go, all it was a pyramid scheme or chain letter, but instead of a chain letter, it was raising tulips over in Barbados, or what is now, where the Paradise Casino stands in Freeport. But before they knew what good use to make of such real estate as that, they had this one guy whose name slips my mind, thank God, who set up the supposedly Ponzi. That was his name, wasn't it? It was because he was the originator of the Ponzi scheme. At any rate, if you ever read about, or I'm sure you've been exposed whether you had any interest, and they'll start explaining one of these great intricate con games. What's going on is always something, but there's been in the last decade, as you know, in the United States, a great thing about the savings and loan debacles, swindles, hoaxes, and all these people are still being tried. Some of them still already in jail. But all these intricate, to the point that the trial, or the hearing before the trial, that the Senate investigated somebody since the taxpayers had some interest. It goes on, and there's a herd, if not a pride, of attorneys show up. And that's all this kind of records that goes on, and they talk about this to the point that even the head of the Federal Reserve goes. In other words, it gets so complicated almost that they say, this has got to be, some commentator will always say, this has got to be the creme de la creme of all swindles and cons. And it's not so. Now, I was going to tell you there's a great one. I say a great one, it's just a great example that happened close by. At any rate, there was speaking of fancy vacation properties, there was a certain man, this actually happened, which is not important, but I'll throw that in because people like it, that found out that there was what had been a fancy money machine hotel in a certain residential area, a certain vacation area in the southeastern part of the United States, as a matter of fact. It was up for sale. It had become a bit round at heel, long in tooth, was no longer a cash cow, and in fact was straining the realtor's ability to come up with other metaphors like that. Or to hide metaphors like that, I should say. To keep potential buyers from coming up with such metaphors as, well, isn't she getting a little long in tooth? Oh, no. At any rate, so they were asking. At one time they were asking a pittance of the price of what it should have been in its heyday, like $1 million. And so this guy comes down. He flies down, comes in on a private jet out of town. They send out a limo. He dressed real nice, plays the game, which to run a good con, you got to have a certain acting ability and a certain presentation. Comes in, they give him a penthouse suite. He spends several days. He goes into great details. He asks for all the books. And he continues to keep calling downstairs to the owners, saying, could you send up more? I would like the meat receipts from who you've been doing business with, the meat suppliers. Because they had 4 or 5 kitchens, 8 bars. And he would say, I want the records from June of 82 to 86. And he'd go through them. They'd be quiet for hours. And he'd call down and say, well, I would like to see the liquor purchases for both the main bars and the small room out by the cabana. Went through all of this. And he still seemed to have interest. And they thought, well, at least he hadn't left. And he keeps going over the books. And he calls, he says, I need to send for my accountants and attorneys. So they send a plane up to New York. They fly them down. It goes through all this. So finally he says, all right, $1 million, what it was. And he says, all right, here's what we'll do. Here, I'm going to give you a third now. I'll give you the rest, the remainder. I'll find the remainder at the end of this month. It was like the 1st or 2nd. So they were delighted. So he wrote them out a check for, approximately $1/3 gives it to them. They give him the keys and all, and they leave, and they shake hands, and he signs a note. The rest of it due the 31st. They walk out. 2 days later, the next day, their bank calls and said the check bounced. He is now in physical possession. I'm not going to tell you all the legal technicalities. Anyway, he stalls them several days. He has an explanation about, well, his funds hadn't been wired from Switzerland to his New York bank. He stalls them around. They try to send it through again. It takes at least a week, 10 days. They're finally convinced that check is not going to ever clear. And by then, they have to call their attorneys, and they're having to now go into court and get him out of here. They can't believe. Well, he still stalls them. I'm running out of time. But he stalls them even more, by the way. He's stalled them around for a couple of weeks. I can explain it how. Because for one thing, they could not conceive of the fact of what was going on. Because what did he have to gain? Was the main thing was he kept, because they thought, well, something's wrong. He'd say, well, wait a minute. And he kept explaining. And they would put back through the check and it'd bounce. It got down close to the end of the month. And that's when they go to their attorneys, and their attorneys say, well, it's going to take us a week. And if they fight it, it could be, well, I don't know when, to get him physically out of here, because he now physically has taken possession of the property. You turned it over to him, and it would be a criminal matter. It'd be trespass for you to actually physically go in there and throw him out, because it's now become a civil matter. Unless we can go in and prove some sort of criminal intent that the check actually he had no account, which he did have an account. He just didn't have any money in the bank. So they're saying that this is not a criminal matter. We cannot go call the sheriff and go in there with guns drawn and throw him out. It's become a civil matter. And they all thought, well, what in the hell why is he doing this? Because at the end of the month, if he doesn't have this, $350,000, if he doesn't have it now, where's he going to get the rest? And nobody could figure out what happened. The day came due for the rest of it. They came there, and he said, well, I don't have it. And he said, sorry, and he walked out. And it took him a while to figure out that at no particular expense to him and his buddies had come in there. A hotel, even though it was not in its prime, a hotel with like 500 rooms, 8 restaurants, 10 bars for a month. They found out, like once an hour, him and his cahoots, they went through every cash register in the place and emptied it, except, left them $10 worth of change. And for a month, all he did was steal the receipts. When I say steal, he was in possession of it. When he left, they could still sue him. But that is a con. How much simpler does it get? He simply conned them by just a little showmanship, a bad check, which anybody can write, for $300,000, and then chutzpah. Well, he had enough sense to know that that would become a civil matter as long as anyway. Think about that. You think this has nothing to do with the human mind? You think this has nothing to do with the way people think? Now I've got to throw in one that some of you have heard privately. But I could never write as a news item because it'd take too much trouble. It's almost impossible to write out in words. It's based upon an old story. And if I have not changed the subject yet, I still either have not or I'm about to. The man goes into a cheap clothing store. They advertise cheapest suits in the world. And he says, well, let me have one of these suits. Let me try it on. They put it on the guy. And he says, well, and the sleeves are down to here. And the salesman says, no problem. He says, what you do is like pull your arms up to right where you want them. I mean, get them. The guy goes, right. He said, do that. And now hold your elbows in like that. And there they are. And the guy said, well, I'll be damned. And he said, let me try on the pants. So he put on the pants. They're way too big. And the waist and the damn crotch is falling down to here. And he goes, well, these don't fit. The guy says, no problem. He says, here's what you do. Take the excess. And he pulls it up, big old wide back here. And he says, and now pull the waist and tuck it into that wide and pull it here behind you. And then pull up. And he said, well, it's too long. He said, well, pull it up where you want it. So he does that. He said, now pull this excess, put it in here. And he said, all right. And he said, now hold your legs together and hold it back here like that. And he goes, okay. And he said, now go get the sleeves again. He said, okay. So and he says, well, what do you think? The guy says, well, he says, okay, the price is right. So he finally gets his money out and he pays the guy. And he says, thanks a lot, come back. And so the guy goes out the door. And he's walking down the street. And two old little old ladies go by. And one of them goes, oh my God, look at the terrible shape that poor boy is in. And no one says, yeah, but don't his suit fit nice? Do you think that that is not a description, if a man had the right insight, to what seems to be your own personality, that is your own mental processes? Because if you can take this right quick, from a certain view, once you start, especially if you start such as this, very easily in the beginning, people even have a more critical view of themselves. That they believe that's part of studying myself, upholding the Socratic tradition, upholding the great mystical tradition of to see what an El Stupido I am. Yeah? And you can say, in fact, you know, this is not me. It makes me suffer. I should be a mystic. I should be smarter than I am. I should be a much better person than I am. It's like saying, look at the terrible shape that poor boy's in. And mentally you think, yeah, but don't my mind fit nice? It's me. If that's you, if you find life comfortable, in case I'll go ahead and tell you the truth, you knew it, all this was connected. Did you hear the news on tonight? There's some dead people are standing around talking. One of them says, God, sometimes I don't think I can bear up under this. And no one says, yeah. And I hear it gets even worse once you're alive. If you got to die to be a better person, which I'm not saying is not possible, but if you got to die to be a better person, notice this, even in man's myths, ordinary people don't pop back to life. It's only the Jesuses, it's only the heroes. So if you're going to be ordinary, if it's going to take death to make you a better person, I hate to put this in words, but we're stuck for time. How much better, even if it's true, that the only way you become a better person is by being a dead person, how much is that going to do if that's it? Because if that is your only form of self-improvement, notice, history, even in myths, even the man just turning his imagination loose, you never, some great myth discovered, some new secret writing, a piece of parchment found in Egypt that tells a tale about these 2 or 3 common guys, a couple of brothers. They were bricklayers and they died, and they buried them, and the whole family cried and they wailed, and then, but that was it. And then 2 days later, they brought back in town. You never hear of it. You know why? Their suit fit too nice. That finally I'm a better person, and they don't pop back. I'm not saying that they could. It's not a choice. Well, how terrible it is to be dead. I mean, look at the terrible shape the boy's in, because usually you think, well, what's worse than death? At least when you're looking at somebody else. And you think, well, what could be worse than that? Look at the shape that poor boy's in. He's dead. And he might be thinking, yeah, but don't my life fit nice? It's me. Is that all? Put it all together.